Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are here to take your source material, unpack the historical narrative, and extract the real insights, the crucial details that fundamentally change how you view a topic.
And today we are shining a light on one of the most unjustly simplified figures in English history, Mary Tudor, or Mary I.
Right. She is a figure burdened by that nickname, Bloody Mary, and she's often just, relegated to a footnote between these towering figures of her father, Henry VIII, and her sister, Elizabeth I.
But if you actually dive into the sources, you find a woman of unbelievable resilience,
Yeah,
political acumen, and a determination that few monarchs, male or female, ever really exhibited.
absolutely. Our mission today is to fundamentally shift your perception of Mary. We are looking beyond the tragedy, beyond the burnings, to reveal a life filled with Herculean daring, as one contemporary actually put it.
Yeah, that's a great phrase for it.
She wasn't a figure of weakness or failure. She was a monarch who overcame immense adversity. And crucially, she defined exactly what female rule would look like in England, for better or for worse.
And what makes her story so compelling is just the sheer contradiction. She was defined by the men in her life. She's a king's daughter, a king's sister, a king's wife,
But she ends up a queen.
a queen who was also, by the same title, a king. She navigated this profound personal pain of phantom pregnancies, illness, rejection by her own father, but she emerged, however briefly, as a successful and powerful sovereign who, in the end, preserved the Tudor dynasty.
And the sources we're drawing from today are robust. It's an in-depth biography focusing on her entire life, really emphasizing her centrality in this chaotic European context.
So let's unpack this extraordinary life, starting right at the beginning with her births and the immediate political stakes.
Mary was born at 4 in the morning on February 18th, 1516, at Greenwich Palace.
And this is the long-awaited child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. So the ceremony that followed 3 days later at the Church of the Observant Friars was designed to be, absolutely magnificent.
It sounds like a full-scale pageant. I mean, the nobility formed the Guard of Honor. They brought in a special font from Christchurch, Canterbury, which was reserved only for royal christenings.
Yeah, they pulled out all the stops.
And she was confirmed under the sponsorship of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, a figure who would become a kind of second mother to Mary, and then later, tragically, a political victim.
And the heralds did their job. They proclaimed her right high, right noble, and excellent Princess Mary, Princess of England.
They performed the ritual perfectly, but the feeling of failure was immediate and just pervasive.
Yeah. This was not the longed-for male heir. Henry VIII had been waiting for years. Catherine had suffered miscarriages, the death of a previous son.
So this singular biological fact that she was a daughter set the emotional and political fault line for Mary's entire existence.
It really did. And that gender disappointment immediately elevated her role onto this massive European stage.
To understand Mary's survival skills, you really have to look at the power embedded in her family tree, especially on her mother's side.
Indeed. On Catherine's side, you have Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic kings.
And these weren't just monarchs. They were the architects of modern Spain, unifying kingdoms that were constantly at war.
And Isabella especially provides such a crucial model for Mary. She was the only queen regnant in 15th century Europe. She was someone who even campaigned alongside her own knights during the Reconquista.
Right, and she established the Spanish Inquisition. This is not a passive figure.
Not at all. So Mary was raised with this fundamental understanding that women could wield absolute, even military power.
So she wasn't just a princess. She was the product of two houses, Castile and Tudor, that had fought, tooth and nail for their crowns.
And that must have instilled in her this almost unshakable belief in her right to rule and, more importantly, a really practical understanding of political survival.
That political pedigree made Mary arguably the most valuable commodity in Europe at the time.
Oh, absolutely. England was strategically positioned to tip this massive balance of power. The Habsburg-Valois rivalry, which was raging between the dominant Spanish Holy Roman Empire and France.
And Mary was, quite literally, diplomatic currency.
And they started trading her early. At just 2 and a half, in 1518, she was betrothed to Francois, who was the 6-month-old Dauphin of France.
It seems absurd to modern ears, but the ceremony itself was pure high Renaissance theater.
It was an incredible spectacle. Huge amounts of cloth of gold. Cardinal Wolsey played the key role, placing the ring on Mary's tiny finger.
And the proxy groom was the Lord Admiral Guillaume Bonnivet. He symbolically slipped the ring over her second joint, signifying, a contract for a future marriage.
It's amazing to think about this toddler performing in this elaborate drama, and the sources have that wonderful anecdote.
Where Mary asks Bonnivet,
"Are you the Dauphin of France? If you are, I wish to kiss you."
which just shows that even at that age, she grasped the performative nature of diplomacy and her central role in it.
Completely. But these alliances were incredibly volatile. By 1522, the political winds just shift.
And Charles V, Mary's cousin, who was 21 at the time, secures an alliance with England by promising to marry Mary, who was then 5.
And Charles was careful. He promised to marry her only if he was free when she reached the age of cohabitation, which was 12.
What's so crucial about that deal with Charles V is how Henry VIII framed Mary's status. He explicitly acknowledged her importance to the alliance.
He called her his sole heir.
Exactly. She was the leverage. If he didn't have a son, she was the key to England's future, a fact that was constantly reinforced by Europe's most powerful man, Charles V.
And this is where Catherine of Aragon deserves huge credit. She wasn't just preparing Mary to be some beautiful, passive bride for a Habsburg or a Valois prince.
No, she was preparing her for power.
Catherine oversaw an education that historians now recognize was a genuine apprenticeship for rule, deeply informed by that Spanish tradition of female authority.
And she chose Juan Luis Vives, the great Spanish humanist, to write the educational blueprints.
And the initial instruction outlined in his work from 1523 sounds very traditional. Virtue, piety, needlework, spinning, basically, avoiding idleness.
Right. Vives even warned Mary to follow her mother's virtuous path, steering her away from Henry's potentially corrupting royal power.
That was the conservative starting point. But the curriculum evolved very quickly, reflecting Mary's undeniable political centrality.
His later work, from 1524, shifted dramatically toward governance. She was reading the classical texts of political leadership: Cicero, Seneca, Plutarch, Plato's Dialogues on Commonwealth Governance.
Thomas More's Utopia, Erasmus's Institutio Principis Christiani.
That is the reading list of a future king, not just a consort. She was absorbing the highest principles of humanist political theory.
And she was brilliant. By age 9, she could write a letter in Latin. By 12, she translated a prayer by St. Thomas Aquinas.
And this depth of education, it really guaranteed she was politically and theologically sophisticated, a crucial point, because it gave her the intellectual armor she would need for the battles to come.
And Henry VIII, despite his later frustrations with her, he recognized this talent. In 1525, at just 9 years old, he dispatched Mary to the volatile Welsh marches.
To preside over the Council of Wales and the marches.
Yeah, she was a queen in miniature.
And it wasn't just a ceremonial title, was it?
No, not at all. Her instructions were meticulous. She was housed in this grand household, managed by Margaret Pole, and she was expected to practice the performance of royalty.
The instructions dictated she should engage in joyous and merry communication, dance, practice musical instruments like the virginals, but above all, be trained in virtuous demeanor.
So she's acting as an authoritative figure, chairing meetings, meeting petitioners, and witnessing the mechanics of governance firsthand. This early training was a vital foundation for her later success.
She understood the weight of the crown long before she ever wore it.
Then comes the great matter, the legal fight for Henry VIII's annulment. This is where Mary's world just shatters.
In 1527, Henry suddenly declared his marriage invalid, citing his conscience being troubled by biblical law, conveniently failing to mention Anne Boleyn.
It was an extraordinary act of political and personal cruelty. But Catherine of Aragon responded with, immense courage drawn from her Castilian heritage.
She was afflicted, sure, but she was defiantly committed to the legitimacy of her marriage.
And her insistence that the matter be decided only by Rome was her political masterstroke.
Her public challenge at the Blackfriars trial in 1529 is just legendary. She threw herself at Henry's feet and publicly used his own declarations of love against him, insisting she had come to him a maid.
She declared that no earthly punishment, not even being torn limb from limb, would compel her to change her opinion on the sanctity of their union. She was challenging the king's authority.
And using religious conviction and public theater to undermine his legal claims. This fierce, unyielding commitment was the model Mary would follow in her own battles years later.
And Mary lived literally in the eye of this storm. For a time, she was the only physical link Henry had left to Catherine.
But the separation became formal and total in 1531. Henry demanded Catherine choose between him and Mary.
And Catherine, desperate and fearing Henry's rage, futilely chose him, hoping to preserve some small scrap of influence.
The cost to Mary was immediate. In 1531, she fell seriously ill, likely the physical and emotional stress manifesting itself, maybe coinciding with the onset of menstruation.
And Henry, driven by his desire to appease Anne, refused Mary's simple request to see him and her mother. The needs of the lady, as he called Anne, took precedence over his own sick daughter.
And Anne Boleyn was a terrifying enemy for Mary. Anne hated her intensely. She recognized that Mary carried the popular support as the true princess, and Henry, despite all his anger, still held some residual affection for her.
So Anne constantly schemed to ensure Mary was separated from her father, and the threats she made were shockingly violent.
The sources show Anne openly boasting that she would have Mary as her maid or marry her off to some varlet of low birth.
And worse, she threatened to have Mary killed by hunger or otherwise if Anne ever became regent. This was, psychological warfare intended to break Mary's spirit.
But the teenage Mary showed that her education and her mother's example had hardened her resolve. She refused to acknowledge Anne as queen or accept her own illegitimacy.
She declared simply that she knew no other queen in England except her mother. This was an act of magnificent defiance, a political statement that could have easily gotten her executed.
The legal hammer fell in May 1533 when Cranmer annulled the marriage, followed swiftly by Anne's coronation.
And the public reaction, it speaks volumes about where people's loyalties lay. Despite the threat of death, no one shouted, "God save the Queen" for Anne.
Instead, the streets reportedly shouted, "Catherine Queen!"
So Mary refused to renounce her title, her rights, her privileges. The retaliation was immediate. Her household was dissolved, including her second mother, Margaret Pole.
And Mary was forced to move to Elizabeth's smaller household at Hatfield. The cruelty Henry inflicted was extreme.
He refused to see Mary for over 2.5 years, blaming her obstinacy on her hated Spanish blood.
And yet, in this bizarre contradiction, when the French ambassador praised Mary's upbringing, Henry reportedly burst into tears. He loved the idea of his daughter, but hated her political stance.
The final blow came in January 1536 with Catherine's death at Kimbleton, after she'd been suffering for months with stomach pain.
Mother and daughter were separated for 4 years and were denied a final meeting. The image of Henry VIII celebrating this death, dressed entirely in yellow and dancing, is one of the darkest moments in Tudor history.
And it profoundly distressed Mary. There was immediate suspicion. Catherine's physician feared a slow and subtle poison.
Whether that's true or not, the rumor highlights the lethal atmosphere of the court.
And the tragedy led instantly to renewed danger for Mary, because Anne, who was pregnant again, menaced Mary directly. She said, "If I have a son, I know what will happen to her."
Mary's fear was completely rational. She was trapped, facing not just bastardization, but possible execution. She became increasingly panicked and hysterical.
Begging the imperial ambassador, Chapuis, to help her flee, she said she would cross the channel in a sieve if he advised it. It shows how completely isolated and broken she felt, preparing herself daily for death.
But the wheel of fortune turned so rapidly in 1536. Anne suffered a stillborn son, and Henry moved against her.
She was charged with adultery and, interestingly, conspiracy to kill both Catherine and Mary.
And before her execution in May 1536, Anne reportedly confessed to Lady Kingston that she had, in fact, conspired against Mary's life, and she begged Mary's forgiveness.
The political fallout was huge. Cranmer invalidated Anne's marriage, which made Elizabeth a bastard, just like Mary.
And the public response was an enormous boost to Mary's legitimacy. The joy shown by the people was, inconceivable, focused not just on the ruin of the concubine, but on the hope of Mary's restoration.
The public felt she was the rightful heir. That was a powerful political mandate for her.
Henry then married Jane Seymour just 10 days later. Jane's motto, "bound to obey and serve," was pretty ironic given her immediate political advocacy.
Right. She sympathized with Mary and pushed Henry for her restoration, much to his initial annoyance.
Thomas Cromwell brokered the terms of Mary's submission, and this was a brutal compromise.
It was. Mary had to write these letters declaring herself Henry's most humble and obedient daughter and handmaid Mary, and critically pledging obedience next unto God.
Which meant acknowledging him as supreme head of the church.
And the cost to her Catholic conscience was so deep that she immediately sought secret papal absolution for it.
But the political relief was tangible. She was treated better, more honored than before, though legally the title of princess was still denied to her.
The great matter had broken her spirit, perhaps, but she had survived the most dangerous political period of her life.
Her legitimacy was still precarious, though. The new Act of Succession in 1536 did not restore her rights fully.
No, it placed the succession on Henry's heirs with Jane Seymour, or any subsequent wife, but it also granted Henry this unprecedented power to nominate anyone he chose as his successor.
It's incredible. If Henry Fitzroy, his illegitimate son, hadn't died shortly after that, Mary's chances would have vanished entirely.
Jane Seymour died in 1537, shortly after Edward's birth, and Mary served as chief mourner, performing the role of the eldest legitimate child, a symbolic statement in itself.
The years following saw her navigating Henry's rapid succession of wives.
She enjoyed considerable favor during the short reign of Catherine Howard, presiding over court feasts and receiving opulent gifts from her father, like these 2 rubies of inestimable value.
So Henry had realized Mary was a valuable asset in terms of court ceremony and image.
And then came Catherine Parr in 1543, who was only 4 years Mary's senior. This was a hugely positive relationship.
Right. Parr was a goddaughter of Catherine of Aragon. She acted as a benevolent friend and stepmother.
And they were both extremely learned women. They began studying together, and this fostered a renewed relationship between Mary and Elizabeth as well.
This familial reconciliation led directly to the 1544 new Act of Succession,
Which was monumental. Legally, Mary and Elizabeth were still illegitimate, but they were placed back in the line of succession after Edward and his heirs.
and this restoration was immortalized in the portrait of the family of Henry VIII, showing Edward and Jane Seymour flanking Henry, with Mary and Elizabeth proudly standing on the sides.
And here is where their training for rule peaked again. Mary and Elizabeth witnessed Catherine Parr acting as regent during Henry's war with France.
So they saw a woman successfully imposing authority on a council of powerful male nobles. This was a critical lesson in female leadership right before they both inherited.
And when Henry VIII finally died on January 28, 1547, the deceit of the court was instantly apparent. His death was kept secret for 3 days.
While Edward Seymour, the new Lord Protector, seized control of the Regency Council,
Mary was very displeased that Seymour did not immediately visit or inform her. She was already being sidelined.
so Edward VI was 9 years old, and the new evangelical establishment, led by Protector Somerset, moved with terrifying speed to dismantle Henry's religious compromises and accelerate the Reformation.
They repealed Henry's conservative Act of 6 articles. They ordered the destruction of abused images, saints, shrines, roods, and mandated English Bibles,
And the crisis reached its peak with the 1549 Act of Uniformity.
which mandated the use of the Book of Common Prayer, a fully English Mass. But for Catholics, the fundamental break was the abolition of the elevation of the host.
Let's pause on that point because it's so vital to understanding Mary's unwavering defiance. For Catholics, the real presence is the belief that the bread and wine literally transform into the body and blood of Christ.
Transubstantiation, yeah. It's a mystery reenacted during the elevation.
By removing this ritual, the reformers were saying this is merely a remembrance, a symbolic gesture, which fundamentally shatters the core sacrament that defined Mary's faith.
Precisely. For Mary, this was not a political disagreement. It was spiritual survival. Her resistance was absolute.
She maintained a large, strictly Catholic household with 6 chaplains, saying Mass daily, trusting in her conscience and an alleged promise from Charles V that she could continue her observance.
This personal conviction led to incredibly tense emotional confrontations. She famously clashed with her nephew, Edward VI, who was just 12.
Edward rebuked her for hearing Mass. Mary countered that he was too young to judge religion. The sources say both were reduced to tears.
But Mary remained defiant. The council pressured her mercilessly to conform. Her response was drawn directly from her mother's playbook.
She asserted she was not offending any law, unless it be a late law of your own making.
And she declared she would prefer death to offending her conscience. I would lay my head on a block and suffer death. She was daring them to execute the true Tudor heir.
And Mary's plight was a crucial lever in European politics. Charles V, her cousin, repeatedly threatened war if she were not granted freedom of worship.
This provided a shield, but Mary never felt secure, especially as the persecution intensified around her.
Her fear was well-founded, and she continuously explored escape plans to the continent. The crisis came in July 1550 with a botched attempt.
3 imperial warships waited off the Essex coast near Malden. Mary's officer, Robert Rochester, grew terrified of discovery because the watches were doubled.
And this is where Mary's composure, built up over years of quiet defiance, just broke. Faced with imminent discovery and capture, she panicked.
She became hysterical and repeatedly cried, "But what is to become of me?" And the plan just collapsed.
That near failure is so telling. It shows the psychological toll of her isolation.
Yet the sheer panic of being captured, of almost escaping and failing, it seems to have fueled her resolve. Because when she's faced with a similar crisis 3 years later, she was ready, resolute, and successful.
The failed escape taught her the absolute necessity of decisive action.
So Edward VI, ailing severely from a separating tumor likely tuberculosis, was determined that his Catholic sister would not undo the Reformation. He was visibly aging and knew his time was short.
In 1553, he drew up his infamous My Device for the Succession, explicitly excluding both Mary and Elizabeth as bastards.
The succession was transferred to Lady Jane Grey and her male heirs. Edward's reason was theological and political. Women were unfit to rule, and Mary would destroy the religion whose fair foundation we have laid.
Northumberland, who married his son to Lady Jane Grey, sought to consolidate his power through her. He tried to lure Mary into a trap, promising her the throne upon Edward's death to secure her presence.
But Mary's close advisors alerted her to the plot around July 1st.
So when Edward died on July 6, 1553, Mary did not hesitate. She immediately fled to Kenninghall in Norfolk,
Demonstrating a tactical speed and decisiveness she lacked during that panic 1550 attempt. She trusted her own political instinct this time, not a nervous retainer.
Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen on July 10, 1553. But there was no joy in the city. The hearts of the people were with Mary.
The sources mention one man, Gilbert Potter, who dared to protest in favor of Mary and had his ears nailed to the pillory and cut off.
So Northumberland controlled the treasury, the tower, and the standing armed forces.
But this is the moment of her Herculean daring. Mary was isolated in East Anglia, relying only on her household servants. She wrote a demand to the council, asserting her claim to the throne by her father's will and preparing for war. She had no army.
Northumberland, confident in his military superiority, set out with over 6,000 men to capture her. But he misjudged the core issue: legitimacy.
He marched south, noting ominously, "The people press to see us, but not one saith God speed us." The common folk saw him as a plotter, and Mary as the rightful Tudor heir.
Mary made herself the focal point of the nation's political identity. She proclaimed herself queen, condemning Northumberland as a traitor.
East Anglian loyalists, the Earls of Sussex and Bath, quickly raised an army under the banner of Tudor legitimacy. The momentum was unstoppable.
On July 20th, she reviewed her rapidly swelling forces at Framlingham Castle, where helmets were thrown high and shouts of "Long live our good Queen Mary" rang out.
And the scale of this achievement is difficult to overstate. On that same day, July 20th, the Privy Council, realizing the popular tide had turned, defected to Mary.
Heralds proclaimed her queen at Cheapside. The streets erupted in joyful, spontaneous celebrations. This was the only successful revolt against central government in 16th century England.
And it was won not by a standing army, but by the sheer, overwhelming popular support for the legitimate Tudor successor. Her resilience paid off spectacularly.
So Mary, at age 37, entered London on August 3, 1553, in this spectacular strategic parade. She was dressed in purple velvet.
And Elizabeth rode behind her, a display of dynastic unity that immediately quelled any further talk of succession issues. An estimated 10,000 people accompanied her entry.
Her coronation in October 1553 was truly groundbreaking. She was the first queen to rule England in her own right, which meant the rituals, designed for a male sovereign, had to be adapted on the fly.
She was crowned in a fashion parallel to her male predecessors, dressed in traditional state robes of crimson velvet, and, crucially, girt with a sword as when one is armed to knight.
The sword, the masculine symbol of military and judicial authority, was bestowed upon her.
They even performed the intensely masculine, chivalric rite of creating Knights of the Bath, with the Earl of Arundel deputizing in her place.
Mary was asserting through ceremony that a female monarch was not a consort or a stand-in, but a divinely appointed sovereign capable of fulfilling all duties previously reserved for a king. She made female sovereignty visible and legitimate.
Mary presented a complex figure to her court. Small, slightly built, reddish hair, but described as great-hearted, proud, and magnanimous.
And intensely intelligent, but also prone to melancholy, ill health, heart palpitations, headaches, and notably short-sighted.
Her work ethic, though, was staggering. The sources describe her as incredibly conscientious, rising at daybreak to transact business incessantly until after midnight.
This was not the work schedule of a figure of weakness. She demanded competence and loyalty.
And she deeply distrusted many Privy Council members who had participated in Northumberland's plot, even if they had later defected.
So to compensate, she appointed loyal Catholic household officers, her princely affinity of proven loyalty, to powerful positions. Men like Robert Rochester, who became controller.
This deep distrust led to her most important and controversial relationship with Simon Renard, the imperial ambassador.
Right, Renard effectively served as her secret private counselor. They met covertly in her oratory, often under cover of darkness or in disguise. Why rely on a foreign ambassador over her own counsel?
Because Renard represented Charles V, her only reliable family link and political protector during the Edwardian period. She felt she could not trust her counsel too much, well knowing the particular character of its members.
So, Renard provided her with unfiltered strategic advice, bypassing the institutional mechanisms she felt had failed her repeatedly in the past. It speaks volumes about the political isolation she felt, even as queen.
Mary's initial actions showed a degree of temperance. Northumberland was swiftly executed. But she initially showed clemency toward Lady Jane Grey.
She claimed her conscience would not permit her to execute her, as Jane insisted she was innocent of the plot and merely a pawn.
However, her severity was focused and immediate when it came to religious treason. She immediately arrested key Protestant figures, Cranmer, Hooper, Latimer, for their roles in supporting Jane's coup and persecuting Catholics.
So this marked her immediate, uncompromising shift towards restoring Catholicism.
Then comes the decision to marry Philip, Charles V's son, which was explosive. This prospect secured England in the Habsburg sphere, which was critical for controlling the sea route to the Netherlands and completing the encirclement of France.
But it terrified the English elite.
Exactly. There was massive opposition from the Council and the Commons, many of whom preferred an English match like Edward Courtenay.
The French ambassador, Noé, actively intrigued, warning that the marriage would drag England into the inevitable Habsburg-Valois War and subject them to Spanish rule.
When the Commons petitioned her not to marry a foreigner, Mary's response was spectacular, a declaration of absolute female authority.
She asserted she was a free woman with sufficient years to choose a suitable partner in love, and she warned that if she were married against her will, she would not live 3 months.
That moment enhanced her authority dramatically. Never before had a Tudor ruler openly flaunted popular opinion expressed by Parliament like that.
She made it clear that while she ruled with Parliament, ultimate decisions about the crown's private life, which was simultaneously the nation's public life, belonged solely to the sovereign.
This resistance quickly boiled over into Wyatt's Rebellion in January 1554. Led by Thomas Wyatt, the rebellion was ostensibly about preventing Spanish enslavement.
Though Mary rightly claimed the marriage was the least of their quarrel, the underlying goal was to replace her with Elizabeth.
And Mary's courage was critical. When she was urged to flee to Windsor or the Tower as Wyatt approached London, she chose to stay at Westminster with only 500 guards.
She even asked to go and fight herself, a clear echo of her Castilian grandmother, Isabella.
She delivered her famous, rallying speech to the Londoners. She reminded them she was their lawful prince, wedded to the realm since her coronation.
Wearing the spousal ring here on my finger, she promised that if the marriage did not appear to Parliament to be for the singular benefit of the whole realm, she would abstain.
And the speech worked. Her resolve rallied the Loyalists, and the rebellion was crushed.
But the aftermath was tragic and severe. Mary was forced to execute Lady Jane Grey and her husband, who were simply too great a threat to stability while Mary had no heir. Wyatt's defeat led to a brutal period of cutting off of heads and inflicting exemplary punishment.
And what of Elizabeth? Mary refused to see her upon her arrival at Whitehall, lodging her in a remote, secure area.
And Renard, the ever-present security advisor, urged Mary to execute Elizabeth, arguing that as long as Elizabeth lived, Mary would never be secure.
Elizabeth spent 11 terrifying months under house arrest.
Despite the violence the marriage provoked, Mary proceeded, but she demanded political safeguards. The actual marriage treaty was meticulously crafted to separate Mary as queen from Mary as Philip's wife.
Right. Philip was not to diminish her power in any way. She was to remain sole queen.
And this was cemented in law. The act concerning regal power was passed, which declared that Mary held power as fully and absolutely as any of her male predecessors.
This law was crucial, as it legally enshrined female sovereignty and provided the political foundation for Elizabeth's later reign. Mary's actions made the crown genderless.
There's a fascinating anecdote related to this. A proposal was brought to Mary that she should take upon the title of conqueror, which would have allowed her to rule above law and ignore her coronation oath.
And she rejected this violently, throwing the document into the fire and declaring her intent to be a parliamentary queen who would maintain the laws and liberties of the realm.
She had fought too hard for her legitimacy to undermine it with tyranny.
So Philip arrived in July 1554, But the celebratory bonfires Mary organized couldn't hide the tension. His entourage faced immediate hostility. Spaniards were robbed and beaten.
And the wedding ceremony in Winchester was a masterclass in symbolic control. At the banquet, Mary was served on gold, Philip on silver, explicitly signaling his subordinate status.
Philip adopted the title King of England, but critically, his prerogatives ceased immediately upon Mary's death. He was a king consort in everything but name.
The personal reality was deeply disappointing for Mary. Philip found her no good from the point of view of fleshy sensuality, though he treated her kindly.
His stay was temporary, driven by war, and Spanish courtiers compounded the tension by openly mocking English customs, like adding sugar to wine.
Philip's primary focus while in England was political, securing reconciliation with Rome.
Yes, he successfully petitioned the Pope to allow Cardinal Pole, the son of Mary's beloved governess, to return and negotiate the settlement regarding the massive amount of church property confiscated during Henry VIII's reign.
So Pole returned in November 1554, symbolizing the official return to the Roman fold.
And then came the devastating, very public tragedy, the vain pregnancy of 1554-1555. Mary was absolutely convinced she was pregnant.
Her stomach swelled, breasts enlarged, symptoms we now understand as monstrous retention of menstrual fluids, likely exacerbated by her intense desire and anxiety.
Letters announcing the birth of a prince were actually prepared and signed.
The expectation reached fever pitch, but the delivery date passed in May 1555. Philip expressed doubt.
And rumors spread like wildfire. Was the queen dead? Was it a mole or lump of flesh? The French ambassador noted Mary was sometimes found sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up, a position a heavily pregnant woman couldn't sustain.
There was no baby.
And this was a source of profound personal heartbreak and an existential political threat. Mary's failure to produce an heir meant the Catholic restoration was temporary and fatally threatened.
And the instability this caused was directly linked to the darkest element of her reign.
The Marian persecutions. They were driven by the belief held by Mary and Cardinal Pole that heresy, willful disobedience to the Catholic Church, was the worst of sins, a contagion that needed to be extirpated to protect the realm's soul.
Mary initially ordered punishment to be inflicted without much cruelty and passion.
But the persecution escalated swiftly and horribly. The use of fire, the traditional penalty for heresy, became the defining image of her reign. Over 280 victims were burned, with Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London, becoming the terrifying face of the enforcement.
The execution process was public and horrifying. The victims were often required to sign recantations and then march to the stake.
The political justification used by Mary's regime was that they were restoring the medieval heresy laws that Henry IV and Henry V had used, arguing that religious uniformity was essential for social order.
And the most famous victim was Archbishop Thomas Cranmer in 1556. Mary nursed a deep personal grudge against him for orchestrating the annulment in Anne's marriage.
She was determined he'd die for heresy, not just treason, as treason would allow him a quicker, cleaner death.
So she ignored the fact that Cranmer, under duress in prison and facing execution, had signed 6 separate recantations.
And when he was finally brought to the stake, Cranmer famously recanted his recantations. In a magnificent final act of defiance, he thrust the hand that had written the submissions into the flames first, crying, "Unworthy right hand."
The impact of these burnings was tragically counterproductive. They utterly failed to extinguish Protestantism.
No, instead they created martyrs, stirring immense admiration for their courage and solidifying Protestants as a dedicated, distant group destined to rise again under Elizabeth.
Then Philip left England in August 1555 for Flanders. Mary was extraordinarily in love with him and was visibly heartbroken, weeping as she watched his ship sail away.
And his correspondence became infrequent. He focused entirely on European politics and even demanded the English crown him king outright.
Philip returned briefly in March 1557, but his purpose was purely transactional.
Right. He needed money and an English declaration of war against France as the Habsburg-Valois conflict had reignited.
And Henry II of France believed Mary was compelled to declare war, stating Philip threatened to never return hither to see her otherwise.
So Mary, despite being married to the realm, was forced to declare war on France in support of her husband. She suffered a profound humiliation shortly after when the French seized Calais, England's last possession on the continent.
Mary reportedly said that when she died, Calais would be found engraved on her heart. Philip left again in July 1557. They would never see each other again.
In her final year, Mary's commitment to Rome led to this ironic conflict with the papacy itself. Pope Paul IV, who despised the Habsburgs and suspected Cardinal Pole of Lutheranism, deprived Pole of his legatine power.
And Mary fiercely defended Pole. She refused the new papal legate entry into the realm, even threatening a new schism. She warned the Pope she would not swerve from their devotion, although for a certain period they were compelled not to obey Pope Paul IV.
Her relationship with Elizabeth remained fraught, defined by Mary's enduring evil disposition towards her sister, whom she saw as a constant reminder of Anne Boleyn and the subsequent affronts and ignominious treatment.
However, Philip, fearing that a succession crisis might lead to the French-supported Mary, Queen of Scots, inheriting, instructed Mary to stop investigating Elizabeth's guilt in plots.
This intervention, purely strategic, is what protected Elizabeth.
Mary died on November 17, 1558, at age 42. Her final conscious act was lifting her eyes for the elevation of the host. The sorrow for Mary was immediately overshadowed by widespread public rejoicing for the accession of Elizabeth.
And Mary refused to formally name a successor, leaving it instead to the force of law, relying on Henry VIII's will and the act of succession she herself had navigated. This ensured Elizabeth succeeded her peacefully.
Her funeral was conducted with all the pomp due to a reigning monarch using traditional Catholic rites. And Mary was accorded the masculine regalia of sovereignty, the banner, the royal helmet, the sword, and the coat of armor.
A powerful visual statement that she had ruled as a king in her own right.
Bishop John White's funeral sermon perfectly summarized the tension in her life, calling her a king's daughter, she was a king's sister, she's a king's wife, she was a queen, and by the same title, a king also.
He noted she wore the spousal ring to the realm until her death. And as her coffin was lowered, the heralds cried, "The queen is dead. Long live the queen."
So if we look back at the life of Mary Tudor, she was undeniably a monarch of profound political skill and resolution. She won the throne against all odds, that Herculean daring unique in the 16th century.
She established female sovereignty in English law. She married the most powerful prince in Europe. And she succeeded, however briefly, in restoring Catholicism. She ruled with the full measure of royal majesty.
The great paradox of her life, though, lies in that she failed as a woman, losing her mother, suffering public rejection, enduring the personal tragedy of the phantom pregnancies, and failing to secure a biological heir.
Yet she triumphed as a queen, setting the essential legal and ceremonial precedents for female rule and, critically, preserving the Tudor dynasty for Elizabeth. Her courage and dignity, even in the face of immense setbacks, were widely praised by contemporaries.
Yeah, Giovanni Micheli, the Venetian ambassador, noted her melancholy but spoke highly of her dignity, stating that, "In adversity nor peril did she ever display or commit any act of cowardice or pusillanimity, maintaining always, on the contrary, a wonderful grandeur and dignity."
She took everything the Tudor world could throw at her, and she defied it.
Her personal tragedies and her zealotry for Rome are what history remembers, but her integrity and successful ascent to the throne are what she should be celebrated for.
She had a difficult inheritance, and she played a difficult hand extremely well, right up until her death.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Mary's desperate attempts to secure her crown through alliance and zealotry ultimately failed to secure her religious goals.
Right. Despite the Marian persecutions and the immense personal cost of the Spanish marriage, the political necessity of preventing a French succession, which would have occurred had Mary, Queen of Scots, inherited, meant that Mary's marriage alliance with Philip protected Elizabeth in the final years.
That's the great historical irony. Her strategic alliance with Spain, aimed at Catholic restoration, inadvertently ensured the long-term survival of the Protestant Tudor dynasty.
So you have to consider, looking back at her life from her initial betrothal to Charles V to her final war with France, how much of Mary's tumultuous, determined reign was dictated not by her own profound religious wishes, but by the relentless hammer blows of the European power struggles outside her borders.
She was caught between Habsburg and Valois interests from birth to death.
And that, in the end, dictated the outcome of England's religious future more than any English king or queen.